No one argues with their own pain. Everyone who hurts acts as if they believe that pain is real. So we could say the ultimate reality is pain. That's how people act. It's in keeping with the claims of many religious traditions. You know, the Jews are always recollecting past pain. I mean, the Christian God is a crucified person. I mean, there's a fair bit of pain there. For the Buddhists, the fundamental maxim is that life is suffering. And it seems to me that there's a metaphysical claim there. And the metaphysical claim is that pain is real. Now, of course, it depends on what you mean by real. But people act as if their pain is real. So that's a good place to start. Now, that poses a problem. Life is a pain. Life is suffering, let's say. And why is that? Well, it's because you can be broken, hurt, and destroyed. And so that seems pretty self-evident. And worse, you know it. And that makes people unique. Like, that's our self-consciousness, right? That's really what separates us in some sense from other creatures. I mean, other creatures have some self-consciousness, like a chimp can learn to recognize itself in a mirror, and so can a dolphin, but you know, that's pretty bare bones self-consciousness, you know. Real self-consciousness is the knowledge of your borders, and not only in space but in time. And as far as I can tell, human beings are the only creatures that have discovered the future. And that's really good because we can plan for the future, but it's really bad because, you know, the future is finite, and that's a big shock to the old system. And it's the existential burden that everyone bears, and it's associated integrally with suffering. And so then you think, well, life is suffering, and it's finite, and that's part of the suffering. That's part of what makes you question the value of existing, and maybe the value of existence itself. So then what do you have to use as a weapon against that? Well, you know, we talked a little bit about responsibility. That seems to work, you know. The amount of responsibility that you adopt in relationship to things seems to increase your meaningful engagement. And you might say, well, what's the most meaningfully engaged activity? And you might say, well, how about a little reduction in the old suffering, you know? So you live your life so that you're not causing undue pain, especially pointless pain. That would be good, and maybe you could even be more useful than that, and you could figure out some ways that some suffering, yours, other people's, both, if you're really, you know, hitting a home run, maybe you can figure out some way that some of that could be rectified. And that seems to be meaningful in and of itself. I mean, if it's pain that makes you doubt the meaning of life, which is perfectly reasonable, then the cessation of pain, the cessation of suffering, the minimization of suffering, as a logical corollary, should be the proper medication. And so I would say that means that there's some mode that you can conduct yourself in that makes you a good person. And part of being a good person is to alleviate suffering. And I don't think you get to question that, actually. If the suffering itself is what's making you question the validity of your life, then you can't also say that the cessation of that is not useful. I mean, you can, but it's completely incoherent. You can claim incoherent things if you want. So then I would say these distilled stories that I'm talking about, the stories that are written, say, by great authors. I'm particularly fond of Dostoevsky, whose works are he's head and shoulders above anyone I've ever read in terms of writers of fiction. He deals with the hardest questions that human beings face, and he has characters on both sides of the argument, and they really lay out the arguments. It's not like Dostoevsky, you know, he's got a belief, and so he has a character, and that character has his beliefs, and that character always wins the arguments. That doesn't happen in a Dostoevsky novel at all. He sets up a character, and then he sets up like 3 or 4 antagonists, and those antagonists, they're not straw men, they're like iron giants. They just stomp his protagonist, you know, and the whole thing is a war between these different conceptions of being, and it's amazing to see, it's amazing to read. So you distill these stories. Great authors distill stories. Great storytellers distill stories. And we have stories that are very, 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 very old. Those are usually religious stories of one form or another, but they can be fairy tales. Because fairy tales, some people have traced fairy tales back, you know, more than 10,000 years. And so they're part of an oral tradition. And oral traditions can last for tens of thousands of years. And you know, it's a story that's been told for 10,000 years is a funny kind of story. It's like people have remembered it and obviously modified it. It's like the game of telephone, you know, where I tell you something and you whisper it to the person next to you and so on. It's like a game of telephone that's gone on for, you know, 1,000 generations, and all that's left is what people remember, and maybe they remember what's important, because you tend to remember what's important. And it isn't necessarily the case that you know what the hell it means. You don't know what music means, but you know, that doesn't stop you from listening to it. You don't know, generally speaking, what a movie that you see or a book that you read means, not if it's profound. It means more than you can understand, because otherwise why read it? Well, so the idea is this, is that we're necessarily nested inside moral systems. The moral systems are predicated on narratives, narrative dramas of sorts, and the moral systems are what orient us in life, and the reason to understand them, to the degree that you can, is because you need to know how to live. Nietzsche said that if you had a why, you could bear any how, and that's good. One of the things that the Auschwitz guards used to do to the prisoners, and this is very telling, so at Auschwitz there was a sign that said, "Work will make you free." It was a little joke, not really a very funny joke. You know, it's the kind of joke that you have to be satanic, is the appropriate term to conceptualize, and to dare to state. So when the Auschwitz prisoners came to Auschwitz, you know, they're already pretty rough shape. They were in cattle cars. They'd been separated from their families. Everything had been taken from them. They were transported for a long time. They were standing up. The kids were suffocating because there was no room in the, you know, it was so packed in there. They didn't have anything to eat. There weren't any toilet facilities of any sort. It was like you got rid of 20% of the people just transporting them. You know, the ones on the outside of the cars, they froze to death because of course it was cold, and pretty nasty. And then when they got to Auschwitz, the guards used to have this game that they would play, and this is part of the work will set you free thing. They would get a prisoner, they'd take a prisoner who's already in pretty rough shape, and then have them carry a sack of wet salt, 100 pounds, from one side of the camp to the other. And you know, when you think of a camp, you think of something like a football field, you know, maybe something that big, fences around it. It's like, no way, man, these were cities. There were tens of thousands of people in these places. So from one side of the camp compound to the other, that was a good hike. And that wasn't bad enough. They had to get them to carry it back and put it in the same place. Now, that's poetic in its malevolence. You know, what you're doing is you're harnessing the human compulsion to engage in useful activity and demonstrating how absolutely futile that is despite its difficulty. Seems like a bad thing to do. People need, it's a parody of meaninglessness, that's what that is. And you know, people need meaning in their lives because their lives are difficult. And so the question is, to what end should you devote your life? And another question might be, well, does it matter? Matter is an interesting word, because matter is matter, but matter is also what matters. And I would say that what matters is more real than matter. At least that's how you act. And then the question is, well, is there something you should be aiming at? It's a good question. That's the question of the meaning of life. And you know, one of the things that's supposed to happen when you come to university is that that's the sort of question that should be addressed. And as far as I can tell, and this might just be my more cynical side, what I see happening to university students, generally speaking, is that they come in clinging to the wreckage of their culture and floating with the pieces, and those pieces are taken away by professors who tell them that everything can be deconstructed and nothing has any real meaning. And it's like when you're finally educated, it's when you're floating out on the ocean and you've got nothing to stay afloat with. It's like, well, then you're done and you can graduate. And it's like, I don't see that as useful. Quite the contrary. So let me tell you a story. The first thing I'm going to propose to you, and we'll talk about this a lot, is that you inhabit a story. That the framework through which you look at the world is actually a story. And here's the story. The story is, you're somewhere, and you're going somewhere. And, you know, that can be conceptual or whatever. It's that, but there's a gradient between where you are and where you're aiming at, which means no more really than you're doing something while you're sitting there. And hypothetically, you're aiming for something better. And so you're in a state of insufficiency, always. The insufficiencies change, and then you're trying to rectify the insufficiency, and you presume that your current state is less preferable to the state that you're aiming at. And then the way that you bring those two together is, sometimes you can do it through thinking, but fundamentally you do it through action. You do it through acting in the world. And so that's sort of the answer in some sense to the mind-body problem. You have a conceptual structure, but when you implement it, you're implementing it not abstractly, you're implementing it through action. And so that's the basic story. It's not a very interesting story, but it's the framework through which you view the world. So it's a value-laden framework. Otherwise you wouldn't be able to act and you wouldn't know what to look at. So it's a value-laden framework. You look at the world through a value-laden framework. So then we might say, well, what is the optimal value-laden framework? That's what we're going to try to figure out. Now, I told you about the war that went on between the communists and the West and how that obsessed me. And so one of the things that I really wondered about was, well, was this just an arbitrary thing? You know, like, did the communists, they had some axioms and we had some axioms, and if you're a moral relativist, you might say, well, who's to say which set of axioms are better? Or even, who's to claim that you could say that a set of axioms, one set is better than another? That's a moral relativist claim, and, you know, fair enough. So I thought, well, maybe this is just an arbitrary thing and it's going to be settled by force. Because that's how you settle an arbitrary claim between two competing systems where there's no room for negotiation. So I thought about that for a long time. I wanted to know what the roots were of the Marxist system and what the roots were of the Western system. And what I surmised was that the Western system was actually something that evolved, whereas the communist system was a rationalist construction that was imposed, and they weren't the same thing. And so then I wondered, well, what's Western culture grounded in, and is there any reason to assume that that's real in any sense? And so that's what took me into the study of the underlying stories, the the fundamental stories upon which our culture, I believe, is based, and some of those are very old. I'm going to tell you a Mesopotamian story. It's one of the oldest stories we know. I'm going to tell you an Egyptian story. Those are sources of our culture, and I think those stories are grounded in much older traditions, and I think they refer to something real, actually real. Now, I already told you that there are different ways of conceptualizing real, and that my initial hypothesis, presumption, axiom, you might say, is that pain is the most real, and the reason I believe that is because that's how people act. Now, you can criticize that. You can certainly come up with an alternate conceptual framework, which the scientists have, because they believe that the most real thing is matter. Maybe we need more than one set of tools to operate in the world. It's possible. So now I want to tell you what I think the fundamental constituent elements are of stories. And one of the things that I hope is that knowing this will make you immunize you against ideology. And the reason, because I believe that ideologies are fragmentary meta-narratives, and they have their power because they're grounded in the meta-narrative, but they only tell part of the story. But they have power because they're grounded in the fundamental narrative. And so, here's the fundamental narrative as far as the characters, let's say. And we're going to say that people are prone to characterize the world. We're social primates, we're social cognitive primates, so we tend to see the world through the lens of a social creature. And so, and partly because we're concerned with acting in the world, and the world is mostly other people, then we conceptualize the ground of that structure for action in characterological terms. So the most fundamental reality is chaos. And chaos is what you don't understand at all. You can't even conceptualize it. You come into contact with it in bits and pieces. When the towers fell, when the Twin Towers fell, chaos reigned for a few days. Everyone was shell-shocked. And that was chaos. And chaos is what you experience when your story falls apart. And that's a descent to the underworld. That's chaos. And basically you live in order and chaos. And order is where, when you do what you think you should do, what you want to have happen, happens. That's order. That's explored territory. And chaos is when you do what you're supposed to do to get what you want, and it doesn't happen. And then that place that you're magically in when that happens, that's chaos. And it has different depths. You could say it reaches all the way to hell, and that usually happens when your life falls apart very badly, and you're down in that chaos, and you realize that it was your fault, and that you did something wrong, and that you knew it and you ignored it. That's the worst form of chaos. So there's chaos itself, and then the next thing is fairly straightforward. You could think there's the individual exists in culture, and culture is embedded in nature. Pretty straightforward. Nature is mother nature for reasons we'll get into, and culture is father culture. And I think that's because the fundamental dominance hierarchies in human primates are masculine, and that nature is assimilated to the feminine because it's, well, for two reasons. First of all, females do the sexual selection among human beings, so they actually are nature from the Darwinian perspective. And second, nature is the productive biological force. And so we've always conceptualized males and females, and we've used that conceptualization to sort out the world at large. It's a metaphor. But it's not just a metaphor, you know, it's reasonable to consider culture as a judgmental father. It's really reasonable because, you know, you have a group of people around you, some friends, some people that watch you work, some judges, and that stretches across a very long expanse of time, and those people, as an aggregate, make an entity that is judging your reputation constantly. And it's perfectly reasonable to personify that because it's like a meta person that's watching you. And so it's a useful metaphor. There's a meta person that's watching you. Well, yeah, there is, obviously. So now you could say, well, that's not real. It's like, it's not real the way a scientific truth is real. It's a different kind of real. Well, nature has two elements. It's destructive and creative. Obviously, there's the beauty of nature and its bountiful element, and then there's, you know, Anopheles mosquitoes and elephantiasis and cancer and starvation and all the terrible elements of nature. And then there's culture, and culture is tyrannical because you have to shape yourself, involuntarily even, to get along with other people. You sacrifice a lot of yourself and develop yourself, but you sacrifice a lot of yourself in that endeavor, right? We have to kind of average ourselves out in order to live together, and some societies are more tyrannical than others, but there's always a tyrannical element. You see that at university, you know, you guys know that to some degree, this is such a big place, it's easy to feel like a number here, and that whether or not you're here or not doesn't matter. The institution doesn't care. Well, that's the tyrannical element of it. Now, it does care because here you are and you're getting educated and all that, and so maybe that's positive. But it's got both. These characters always have two sides. You know, there's the negative side and the positive side of nature. And there's the negative side and the positive side of culture. And then there's the individual. So the individual is like standing on an island in the midst of an ocean. That's a good imagistic conceptualization of your position. There's solid ground, it has a limited expanse, and outside of that is everything you don't understand. And you as an individual have a positive and negative element as well, and that's the hero and the villain. And of course, what good is a story without a hero and a villain? And the villain is the person who isn't acting like a person should act, and the hero is the person who's acting like a person should act. And so you go to movies and you read books, and there's heroes and there's villains, and to some degree what you're doing is you're fleshing out your notion of a villain. You know, you read about 30 villains and you think, well, there's something villainous about the villains that's the central element of villainy, whatever that is, and you could imagine you construct out a meta villain and a meta hero, and those are the characters in religious stories, generally speaking. You know, in the Marvel movies, there's Odin, and Odin has two sons, right? Thor and Loki. Thor is like Thor is the world-redeeming hero, and Loki is the trickster who wants to bring everything down. And you have to recognize that in yourself, or it's useful to, because otherwise you underestimate.
Is this positive psych?
No, it's maps of meaning. Positive psych. It's definitely not that. Why might you be villainous? Well, first of all, because you can be. That's a big deal. You can be. It's actually an offshoot of empathy. This is something that took me decades to figure out. I figured it out when I was studying the book of Genesis, because in the book of Genesis people become self-conscious and they immediately have the knowledge of good and evil. And I just couldn't figure that out. It's like, what the hell's the relationship between that? And then really, I tell you, I thought about that like for 30 years, trying to puzzle that out, and then I realized what it was. If you're self-conscious, you can conceptualize yourself as a being. You know that you are, and you know what you're like, and you know what hurts you and what doesn't. And as soon as you know what hurts you, you know what hurts her. And so that's the knowledge of good and evil that comes along with being self-conscious. This is something that distinguishes human beings from every other animal. You know, a lion will eat you, but it doesn't really want to tear you apart slowly just for the fun of it. Well, it eats you, it just wants to eat you, and you know, you could call that evil. It sucks, that's for sure. but animals are beyond good and evil in that sense. But human beings, man, we can aim our malevolence, and we're really good at it, because we can imagine, God, this would hurt, and if it hurts me, man, it's really going to hurt you. So, and you need to know that you're like that, because you are like that. And if you don't know you're like that, or if you don't think you're like that, you're even more like that than you think. Because the people who are most like that are people who don't think they're like that at all. And you have to contend with that. And that's why in many systems of thinking the world is conceptualized as a battle between good and evil. And it's an appropriate conceptualization. It's a meta-conceptualization. And the culture is the wise king and the tyrant, and that's always the case. And you're always stuck with that, because as an individual, with your negative side and your positive side, your negative side is the resentful side that is irritated at the limited conditions of being and the suffering that entails, and its arbitrary and unfair nature. And no wonder, like, that side has a case to make. It's not trivial. In the Brothers Karamazov, that argument is laid out beautifully. There's a character, Alyosha, who's a monastery novitiate, and not really a sparkling intellect, but a very good person. And he has a brother, Ivan, and Ivan's a vicious genius. And Ivan just takes Alyosha apart, and partly he does that by telling a story about, that Dostoevsky took this from a news story. The news story was that this mother and father had taken their young daughter and locked her in the outhouse overnight when it was like 30 below, and you know, she stayed out there crying and screaming and froze to death. And Ivan basically said to Alyosha, you know, a world in which that could happen should not be. It's a good argument, you know, and you can multiply that by millions of examples. So the part of us that is opposed to being and resentful, it's got a point, man. The problem, as far as I can tell, is that if you act that out, then it makes what you're objecting to worse. Now, you might be happy about that, and you might think, well, people couldn't be consciously pursuing that, but yes, they can. I would recommend a book called Panzram if you're interested in that sort of thing. It's a book written by a man who raped 1,200 men and killed dozens and burned things down to the ground every chance he got, and tried to start a war between England and the US, and who was aimed at nothing but mayhem. And he wrote an autobiography at the request of a doctor who had befriended him, and he tells you exactly what he did and why. The story. Hero and adversary, order and tyranny, destruction and creation. That's the basic landscape, and outside of that, chaos. And so let's take a break. Here's another way of looking at this idea. The individual is the person who pays attention and explores and masters, or who looks away. And the person inhabits an explored territory, and this is unexplored territory. And so wherever you go, there's you and the two halves of you that you have to contend with, and wherever you are with people, there's the society with its tyrannical and beneficial nature, and the society in some sense is that match between what you're doing and what's happening. It's really important to get that right. And then unexplored territory, that's wherever and whenever what you're doing stops working. And so it's not exactly a geographical idea, you know, because when you think of explored territory, you think of geographic landscape, like the domain of an animal, you know, or like your house. And you know, that's definitely an element of it. But you know, if you're in your house and a snake comes into your living room and you're in there, it's like, well, that's an important difference between your house 1 second ago and your house now. And so your house can turn into unexplored territory at the drop of a hat, and that's because we live in space and time. And so the unexplored territory is conceptual, it's a conceptual territory, and it's just wherever you are when things aren't working for you the way they're supposed to be. And so, and these are permanent parts of the human experience, which is why I think they are fundamental characters in our narratives. There's always you, there's some subject of the story, and that subject is an ambivalent person with many different potentials, and you're always somewhere, and it's with other people because that's our territory, right? I mean, we're social beyond comprehension, and you know, even our primate ancestors, most of their territory was other primates, and their brains and our brains are specialized to view the world as an aggregation of personalities. It's really important to us, and so we tend to view the whole world that way. And then unexplored territory, well, that's where you don't know what to do. But you know, you do know what to do when you don't know what to do. Peculiarly enough, it's rather non-specific. It's this generalized stress response, and so what happens is you freeze, roughly speaking, if the threat is enough. Then you produce a lot of cortisol and a lot of adrenaline so that you're bloody well ready to move quick in whatever direction you have to, and then maybe you pay more attention, and that's what you do when you don't know what to do. And the problem with that is you can stay in that state forever, man. That's kind of what post-traumatic stress disorder is. It's like you're just like that all the time, and the problem with that is it's very uncomfortable. I mean, you stay like that for any length of time, you're going to get depressed, you're going to develop an anxiety disorder, you're going to get old, because you're burning up resources like mad. You know, your system is shunting everything to maintain that state of emergency preparation, and it's exhausting. It's not where you want to be. So that's partly why people are so prone to defend their territories, their familiar territory, because if their familiar territory is invaded or disrupted, then they default back to this state of emergency preparation, and that's like, that can unglue you if it's profound enough. You know, and you guys know this already. I mean, I think people experience this most particularly when they're betrayed by someone they have an intimate relationship with, you know, when they're lied to. There's other ways, the collapse of a dream or a vision that you've been pursuing, or an illness, or the death in a family. There's lots of other ways, but betrayal is a really good one, because if you're with someone for a long time, you trust them, you have a representation of your past, you have a representation of you in the relationship, you have a representation of them, you have a representation of relationships, you have a representation of the future. You get betrayed, it's like poof, even the past isn't what you thought it was. You know, and what about you? You know, how clueless are you? And maybe not at all, or maybe ultimately gullible, you don't know. Is it your fault? Or, you know, are you so clueless that you just can't protect yourself? Or was the person malevolent in some subtle way that you failed to detect? Everything's up in the air. Not good. And this idea that human beings travel to the underworld and come back is like, it's a really useful thing to understand, because we do that all the time. Whenever we fail, it's like whoop, down into the underworld for a while where everything's in chaos, and then maybe we sort ourselves out and bang, we're back up. And so one way of conceptualizing yourself is not as order and as not as chaos, but as the thing that traverses between the two domains. And that, I would say, is the mythological hero. So I'm going to start talking to you about Pinocchio a little bit, weirdly enough. I hope you enjoy this. And the reason I want to do it is because I want to put some, I want to bring what I told you abstractly down to earth. And then you can start thinking, well, do the conceptions that I've introduced to you, are they good for anything? Do they help? That's the order, descent into chaos, re-establishment of order. That's Paradise Lost, Profane History, Paradise Regained. It's the classic comedy, and that's the story of life. And so the question is, how do you manage it? And so that's a question you really want to know the answer to. So you'll pay money, weirdly. You'll line up and pay money to see a story about that, even if you don't even know that that's what the story is about. And the reason for that is that actually part of you does know what the story is about. You know, your cognition has multiple layers. You understand things that you don't know you understand in ways that you don't understand. And you can tell that because, you know, we talked about Pinocchio a little bit, how absurd it is, and that it doesn't matter. Well,
sorry, I have a question. So we've been talking, chaos is when people don't do what they expect to do in the negative sense. So something bad happens to you. What if the reaction is extremely positive, like something that you don't expect, like winning a lottery? Do you also go into a stress response, or? So it would be the same thing?
No, it's not quite the same thing. It's a good question, and we will address that. We will address that. I mean, winning the lottery is generally not a good idea for people. You know, because it's just too much. It's too much for them. It flips their lives upside down. So, and they tend at best to return to their original baseline level of emotion. But yes, something remarkably good, I mean, it's a lot better than something remarkably bad, obviously, but it still can have that destabilizing effect. So it depends on what elements of your life it disrupts. Like in some sense you have a map that you're operating within in the world, and that map is predicated on assumptions of different sorts, some shallow, some profound. When the profound assumptions are devastated, huge chunks of the map are invalidated, and that can happen sometimes when dramatically positive things happen as well. So, but the fundamental rule is the more of your axiomatic presuppositions are disrupted, the harder it is on you. You know, like maybe you quit your job because you won the lottery. It's like, hey, I'm off to the beach, I'm going to drink margaritas. It's like, that'll work for about 4 days. You know, you do that for 3 months, you're a beach alcoholic. It's like, that's a real improvement. You know, so it's not that easy. And often too, if you take people out of their routine, you know, they just flounder. Their circadian rhythms go, they don't eat properly, they don't know what the hell to do. You know, so this is often why people have such a hard time when they retire. I'm going to retire and relax. It's like, if I relaxed for 2 weeks, I would die. You know, I need something to do. I need to be engaged in something. So, okay. Pinocchio, Disney movie, an early one, a masterpiece. And so I'm going to walk you through it, and I'm going to tell you what I think it means, and you can tell me if you think that that's useful. And I'm only going to do that for about 10 minutes today because I do want to cover some of the details of the class, and then next class we'll continue with this. So the movie opens with the opening credits, which are carved wooden signs, which is like a hint, you know, because Geppetto's a carver. And it starts with this song, which was actually quite a popular song, and it's a bit of a, what would you call it? I don't think the poetry is particularly profound, but it was a song that people liked and people still listen to, and it sets the tone for the movie, which is what music does. One of the things that's really interesting about movies, that's really mysterious, is that, you know, if you go to a movie, there's almost always a soundtrack, right? If you go to a movie and there isn't a soundtrack, it kind of feels empty. It feels like there's something missing. And, you know, it's as if the music, you know, when you go to a movie, there's lots of things you can't see. The characters are only partial, and you don't know anything about their background, so it's like a low resolution thing. And what seems to happen with the music is that it provides the emotional background, the complex context, let's say. It's like a substitute for the context, and it guides you in your perceptions of the movie. It gives you hints about what's going to happen, and the funny thing about that is that we just don't have any problem with that. You know, it's like, yeah, of course a movie has a soundtrack, and of course when there's a dramatic scene the music gets dramatic, but that doesn't happen in real life, so you'd wonder why we would accept it in a movie. And I think it's partly because we're willing to accept the amplification of reality that constitutes a movie. And in fact we find that compelling, and music is one of the things that does that amplification, the dramatization, and that's acceptable to us. This song I find quite interesting, so I'm going to take it apart quite a bit. In some sense I feel foolish doing it, because it's, you know, it's a childish song in some ways, but that's okay. When you wish upon a star, makes no difference who you are. Well, okay, there's some mysteries there. People wish upon stars, that's like a little ritual, right? Why do they do that? Well, and what exactly is a star? That's another question, because there are stars that shine in the heavens, and there are people who are stars. And so, why are people stars? Well, they're usually famous people, right? They're people who attract a lot of attention, and maybe they're people who have a lot of talent. That's another possibility. Maybe they're models. I don't mean, you know, clothing models, although sometimes they are, but they're models for emulation. That's what being a star means. That's why People magazine is full of stars. It's like they're like heroes brought to earth, and of course you know nothing about them. All you know is their public persona, and of course they're usually very attractive, and so that allows you to project upon them all the things that would go along with ideal humanity. And so they're stars. But still, why stars? Well, stars beckon in the darkness, right? And they're otherworldly. That's the thing that's cool. They're not of this earth. And I mean that technically, because obviously they're not of this earth, but I also mean it phenomenologically. I mean it as an element of human experience. So most of you are urban, and so you've not had the experience of, perhaps, of the full night sky, you know, and that's really too bad, because the full night sky is one of those experiences that actually induces awe, naturally, you know, and no wonder. You look up there and there's just stars everywhere, right? You're looking at the edge of the galaxy. That's the Milky Way, right? It's the edge of the galaxy. It's like, wow, there's the edge of the galaxy, and there's just so many of them, and it's such an expanse. You're looking into infinity. You're looking into the unknown. You're looking beyond yourself, that's for sure. And you know, that produces a sense of awe in people, like looking at the Grand Canyon or something like that. And you're looking at something that transcends yourself. But that feeling of awe, that seems to be something that's a natural part of our response. You know, you might feel awe when you meet someone that you regard as particularly admirable as well, because you feel that there's something transcendent about them. So here's an interesting thing to think about. There are people you admire, and there are people that you don't admire. And that's a clue, right? That's a clue as to your value system. And it might be not really something you can even put your finger on. It's like you find this person captivating, you find this person admirable. And it's as if there's something inside of you that's looking for what's admirable, you know, assuming that you are. And that person who's admirable has a faculty, some faculty, that you would like to have for yourself. And so they're a model for emulation. And that's part of how people develop, you know, like little kids often develop little hero crushes on older kids, you know, not that much older, but sort of the person that's sort of just within their grasp, and then they follow them around and imitate them, and you know, so they're imitating what they find admirable. Well, the fact that you find something admirable is a hint as to the structure of your unconscious value system. And so you could think, even as an exercise, you could think, well, what qualities of a human being do I find admirable? You have to ask yourself that, in a sense. You can't really think about it. There is a difference between asking yourself a question and thinking about it. You know, because it's more like when you're asking yourself a question, it's contemplative. It's like, well, what do I find admirable? It's a question. You don't know. And if you're fortunate, and this happens quite regularly, an answer will float up from wherever the hell answers float up, and you know, oh yeah, that's one, and you can write that down, and you get some idea of what your ideal is, you know, and you have one likely, and what your counter ideal is. Star. Well, to wish upon a star is to raise your eyes above the horizon and to focus on something transcendent that's beyond you. To focus on the absolute, we could say, to focus on the light that shines in the darkness. Now, a star is, people wear diamonds because they're like stars, or they're like the sun, and they're pure and perfect, and they glitter. And so there's something about the light too. There's something about a source of light. It's a source of illumination and enlightenment. And the light that shines in the darkness is a deep metaphor, right? It's what you want. You want a light to shine in the darkness. And so the star has all that. And so people wish upon a star because they have some intuition that aiming above the mundane has the potential to transform themselves. They make a wish. Well, if you're going to make a wish, you should aim at something high. And even just aiming at that is more likely to make the wish come true. And this is not metaphor. You know, I have this program which you guys are going to do called the Future Authoring Program. It's one of two assignments. One is that you write an autobiography. That's the past authoring. The other is that you write a plan for the future. That's the future authoring. I would recommend that you get started on those right now. Like, not right now, but like really soon, because they're harder than you think. And some of you are going to write like 15,000 words. You're going to get sucked right in. This happens all the time. You're going to get sucked right into it. And so you write an autobiography because you need to know where you are and who you are right now. Because how the hell are you going to plot a pathway to the future unless you know where you are? And then you need to write about the future because you aren't going to hit something unless you aim at it. That's for sure. And lots of times people won't aim at what they want because they're afraid. The reason they're afraid is because if you specify what you want, you've specified your conditions of failure. You know when you fail. And it's better just to keep it foggy. It's like, well, I don't know if I'm succeeding or failing, but you know, I can't really tell. Well, great, except you can't hit anything you don't aim at. And so the future authoring program is like it's an attempt to have you articulate your character. And so is the past authoring program. Who are you? And you know, the past authoring program, it asks you to break your life into epochs and then to write about the emotional, you know, the things that you regard as important events that have shaped who you are. And you know, you may find that some of that writing makes you emotional. And I would say, if you have a memory that's more than 18 months old, roughly speaking, and when you bring it to mind, it has an emotional impact, especially a negative emotional impact. It's like part of your soul is stuck back there. And I know that's a metaphorical way of thinking about it, but what I mean is that the reason that you still experience the emotion is because you have not solved the problem that situation faced you with. It might be a real problem, like maybe you got tangled up with someone who was really bad, and that's rough, man, because you've got to come up with a theory of malevolence to deal with something like that, and that's no joke. But if it still produces emotion, it means you haven't solved the problem, and your brain is still tagging it as threat. It's a part of your territory that you did not master. Threat, 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 threat. And until you take it apart, and articulation really helps that, writing really helps that, then you're not going to free yourself from its grip. And that might not be that pleasant. I mean, this is one of those situations where doing it tends to produce a decrement in people's mood in the short term, but quite radical improvements 3 to 6 months down the road. You know, and it's often the case that you unfortunately have to do something you don't want to do in order to progress. It's very, very common. So, and the future authoring program asks you about different dimensions of your life. Like, because you know, you can think of yourself as a personality inside your head, but you're nested in systems that transcend you, and they're just as real as whatever's in your head. It's like, well, what do you need for life? Well, that's pretty easy actually. Some friends, that's a good thing. Intimate relationship, that's a good thing. A family, you know, either the one you're going to produce or the one that you come from, where people to some degree love and care for one another. That's a good thing to work on. You need some plan for your career. You've got to fit in somewhere that people regard as important and that they'll trade with you so that you can live. You need something worthwhile to do with the time that you're not at work, and you need to pay attention to your mental and physical health, and you need to regulate your use of substances, which is a strange one, but alcohol does lots of people in, so it's worth thinking about. That's why we put it in there. So then it's like, okay, what the hell do you want? What do you want from your friends? What do you want from your family? What do you want from your career? If you could have what you wanted, and that's what the program asks you, 3 to 5 years down the road, you get to have what you want. Now I'm assuming that you're going to approach this like, you know, reasonable adults and not like 13-year-old dreamers. I think I want the most expensive yacht in the world. It's like fine, but you know, that isn't really what, it's supposed to be more concentrating on your character. And so then it asks you to write for 15 minutes without thinking too much about grammar or sentence structure, any of that, about what your life could be like 3 to 5 years down the road if you were treating yourself like someone you cared for and you were helping them figure out what they wanted. And then it asks you to do the same thing in reverse, which is to think about the ways that you're radically insufficient and your faults. And everyone knows this, I think, you know, maybe not, but everyone has a sense of if they were going to degenerate, how they would do it. You know, some people would be an alcoholic, some people would be a street person. It's like there's some doom thing out there that's got your name on it if you're particularly incautious and, you know, don't and let things fall apart. So I want you to write about that. What do you not want to have happen in 3 to 5 years? And there's psychological reasons for this, eh? One is, if you have something to aim for, that's a source of positive emotion, because your positive emotion is mostly generated by evidence that you're moving towards something that you value. It's not generated so much by accomplishing something, because when you accomplish something you're just left with the problem of whatever you're going to do next. So you graduate from university, it's like, you know, hooray, one day you're at the peak of your undergraduate university career, the next day you're unemployed and looking for a bad job at Starbucks. So, you know, well, you see what I mean, is, you know, it's that, you know, one problem that you solve is replaced by another problem, and so the idea that you're going to be happy when you solve all your problems is like, haha, good luck with that theory. But, you know, if you're aiming at something worthwhile, and you really believe it's worthwhile, and you've thought it through, you know, so that you're not weak, you've got your damn arguments mustered, then when you make progress, even a little bit, you think, hey, that's all right, and you get a little kick, you get a little dopamine kick, and that's what you want, because that's where your positive emotion comes from. You can use cocaine if you want, but but you know, that tends to have relatively detrimental medium to long-term consequences, but it activates the same system. So you have to be aiming at something, and you should be aiming at something that's realistic, that you want, that you could get, you know, like not easily, because if it's easy, in some sense you've already got it. It's got to push you, that's part of the pleasure actually, because there's two things that you want to do when you're pursuing something that's important, and one of them is to get the thing that's important, but the other is to make yourself better at pursuing things, right? So you can get both of those at the same time. You're aiming at something and you're increasing your competence. It's like, that's a good deal, and there's a lot of intrinsic meaning to be felt in that. And then the second half of the program, you write out a plan for how you're going to do it and how you're going to keep yourself on track, and you're going to write about why it would be good for you if you did this, and why it would be good for your family, and what possible benefits it would have to the community, you know, because you want to nail this thing down, and then you want to figure out what kind of obstacles are going to come up and how you might overcome them and how you might keep yourself on track and all of that. And we know, because we've actually done a lot of research on this particular program, that if university students do this, and this is more true if they're not too well oriented to begin with, if university students do this, they're about 25% less likely to drop out, which is a lot, and about their grade point average increases about 20%. So hooray for that, you know, because you never know when you develop an intervention if it's going to work. There's also evidence, but not from my lab, that doing such things improves your physical health, and I think the reason for that is that, you know, when you go over your autobiography and you scour out those negative places that you're sort of dragging along with you, it lowers your overall stress load, because your brain is kind of, I think it's calculating how dangerous the world is by attending to the ratio of successes to failures that you've had in your life, something like that. And so, you know, if there are holes in your map that you could still fall through, then your brain regards the territory still as a bit on the dangerous side, and then you're more prepared for emergency action, and that's hard on you. So you want to go back there and fix up those experiences to the degree that you can. Now, those are going to be peer graded. Now that's complicated, but here's how you do it. Write the thing so that you have written it for you, and then take everything out that you're not comfortable sharing with other people. And so there's a couple of reasons I do it that way. One is just that there's just no other way to do it, because if I want to do this with you, the grading load is too high to do it. So I thought, well, it's still worth doing, and because this is a class about narrative and about self-narrative, it's the right thing to do. And most of you are graduating soon, and it's like, it's helpful. I think you'll find it very helpful. That's what students report. And so you'll each read, 3 people will read each of your offerings and give you a grade, and then you get the average of the best 2 grades, and they're supposed to provide you with constructive feedback. And constructive feedback is sort of mostly what did you do right, you know, and maybe some hints about where you could flesh it out and all that. But so that's that, and you need to write an essay. This is all detailed on the website, and that's the website. If you go to jordanbpeterson.com, on the left there's classes. If you click classes, you get a bunch of tabs, and one of the tabs is Psych 434, and that's obviously this class. And so there's some extra readings on there, and a list of how we're going to go through the course. The dates aren't right, I got to update it, and I haven't finished that yet, but the rest of it's pretty much the way it is. This writing program is an online program, and it guides you through the process of doing it. But really, I would really recommend that you start like this week, because it also works better if you do it over time, and it seems like in bursts of writing, you know, and to sleep in between episodes, because that's when your brain consolidates its new information. And I would say do it meditatively, you know, ask yourself, it's a different way of, it's really funny what happens when you ask yourself questions, because part of you will answer, and you don't know what the answer will be, but an answer comes almost always. And you know, like you think, well, what happened to me when I was 6, around 6, that was important, and through some mysterious process perhaps a memory will come to mind. And so there's a test, so there's these 2 assignments plus the essay. The essay can be in anything you want that's related to the class. You have to make the case that it's related to the class, so it's an opportunity to, you know, to write about something you want to write about. And there's a final exam, and the final exam, if you read the book and you come to the classes, you won't have any problem with the final exam, because it's not tricky, it's just a survey of what we've gone through. And so I did that. I didn't have that to begin with, but you know, you need a carrot and a stick, because you guys are busy, and you know, you're going to triage and do the things that are crucial and perhaps not the things that aren't, and no wonder. So I had to make this crucial, because otherwise you won't read it, and that's partly because it's hard. And so, but hopefully the course lectures will help guide you through it. And that's about that. So I'm going to tell you a bunch of stories, and I'm going to try to explain what they mean. And what I hope will happen is that the world of narrative will open up for you, and like I found that incredibly useful. It's incredibly useful to understand these things. It situates you better, and it also helps you. See, what people tell me about this course frequently is that it's something like that they already knew what I'm telling them, but they didn't know that they knew it. so it makes sense, it clicks, and you know, to me what that means is that you have the information represented in you in action, like in your procedures, in your habits, and in your perceptual structures. It's implicit, it's the implicit you. And then I can articulate in part what that implicit you is, and it fits, click, oh yeah, that's what I'm like, that's what people are like, that's what people are like. And so, well, if any of that happened today during this lecture to you, well then that's a good sign that you might, you know, benefit from the course. And if it didn't, well, you could try one more lecture and see what happens, but you know, this is sort of what the course is like, and if that's what you want, then this is where you get it. Good to see all of you, and I guess we're done, right?